documents. One is the tax cap revenue scenarios with 4 different tax cap calculations and how those play out, and showing the impact on the tax levy. And there are 4 different revenue scenarios, which is a 1-page document. This process really comes down to an if this, then that choice be made, and there are multiple choices to be made. So it really becomes like a plate of spaghetti. The agenda, I want to start with a review of how we got to where we are now before laying out the different options and for proceeding forward. The first step in this year's budget development was developing a cast forward budget and comparing that to the projected revenues once the executive budget proposal was released in January by the governor. The EBP is especially important for school districts like ours that are very dependent on state aids. This district receives nearly 70% of its operating revenues in the form of state aid. So what happens in Albany has a dramatic impact on us. After comparing revenues and expenditures, the work of reducing any gap between the two begins. This year, with the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, the budget process was dramatically upended as the administrative team worked to understand the impact on the state budget as well as on our district's budget. The goal has been to build a budget that not only balances the district's budget to available revenues, but also plans for contingencies for potential mid-year aid reductions. The initial revenue projections based on the EBP and the tax cap formula had a total revenues of just under 17.5 million, including the use of appropriated fund balance. Expenditures, however, were projected at over 18.3 million. This included a projected 4% increase for those covered under the Morrisville-Eaton Faculty Association contract. The MEFA contract expires June 30th, and bargaining was scheduled to begin later this spring. The initial draft then had an $830,000 shortfall. And that's sort of where we left off before everything hit the fan. But what were we doing to address it? Well, first off, our initial budget was I would describe it as conservative. We estimated expenditures on the high end. A 4% MEFA contract increase, as I mentioned, 8% increase in health insurance premium, 16% increase in our cost for TRS, where the reimbursement rate goes from 8.86% to 10.25%. A 5% increase in utility costs, and no reduction in BOCES special education services. As these numbers were updated, for example, the health insurance being finalized in mid-March with a 6.5% premium increase instead of 8%, the budget was revised accordingly and the gap was closing. That's in mid-March, and then this happened. The global pandemic of COVID-19 hit New York State, closing schools and businesses. The fallout has been significant to local, state, and national economies. And while we wait on news from Albany concerning the impact that this would have on the state budget that was being developed and on the district's aid projections for next year, the administrative team began a comprehensive review of the budget. More than 60 key budget items were reviewed, discussed, and scored. And the cost impact of each of these items was determined. The scores from the team were then averaged to compile the recommendations to the school board for your consideration, and it's those scores that are included in the narrative report. We basically went from a scale of 0 to 3, 0 being untouchable, and 3 says, yes, it can be reduced or eliminated from the budget now. So before we received the state aid run on April 1, we were already working on 25 different budget scenarios in theory, 5 different revenue scenarios and 5 different expenditure scenarios. And the expenditure scenarios were reflective of the scores that the administrative team gave, and then we cross-referenced those against the different revenue scenarios. The outcomes, most outcomes were not good. Revenue scenario 1 was a high water mark on the revenue side with the EBP, which was the EBP released in January, whereas revenue scenario 5 includes draconian aid cuts of up to 15%. Expense scenario 1 was the cost of these, the draft 1 budget as it was modified. over 18 million, while the expenditure scenario 5 includes cutting essential programs and services. Still, out of these 25 combinations, only 7 of them would put the district in the black without additional revenues. On the expenditure side, the team came to consensus on 9 items that could be reduced and eliminated from next year's budget. These cuts were reflected in expenditure scenario 3 in the previous 2 slides. These are the items that scored the 3 by the team. 1, reduce the maximum increase for a new MIFA contract to 2%. Second, fund certain legal expenses from the liability reserve rather than out of the operating budget. Other legal expenses would still be in the operating budget. 3, reduce the utility budget from a +5 over current year budget, which is higher than it needed to be, to closer to actuals for the last 2 years to reflect additional savings generated by the EPC, Energy Performance Contract. Reduce the maintenance service contracts. Eliminate classroom furniture and equipment budgets. Eliminate a new special education teacher position. This was created for specific needs of one student who is no longer in the district. Reduce BOCES special education budget by a placeholder amount intended to hold that budget line at the same level as last year. Eliminate a contracted service that is not likely needed for next year. And then recalculate benefits costs based on increased unemployment and lowered benefits, which actually ends up increasing in this case. Collectively, yes.
Just for clarity's sake, I just want to emphasize that that 4% you have for MIFA contract that we had, that was for budgeting perspective, looking at a worst case scenario, and that we didn't have a plan of having a 4% increase in teacher salaries. But I just wanted to emphasize that that was a placeholder number, and we were using that number as a worst case scenario.
Thank you for that clarity. Absolutely, you're correct.
Or best case scenario if you're a teacher.
Yes.
Collectively, these 9 items represent about $330,000 in spending reductions. It's a start, but until the state releases its budget, we wouldn't know if it was going to be sufficient. So then we get the state aid run. This was released a day or 2 before the budget was formally approved and adopted, but it was released on April 1, and it actually closely resembles revenue scenario 2 that I had on an earlier slide. No increase to the foundation aid allocation, but other aid amounts, expense-driven aids, would change according to the formulas that drive them. There are 5 key points to the April 1st aid run that are identified on this slide. The most important in the long run will end up being the last one listed. But it is the first one, the 0% increase in foundation aid, that is critical to immediate budget building. So you see the 5 points there: 0% increase to foundation aid, formulas for expense-driven aids remain in place. The Federal CARES Act aid that we had just talked about before, the $150,000 was added to the general aid, but the state pandemic adjustment negates that dollar for dollar. The 5th item is that the state budget director has the authority to adjust state aid payments mid-year if revenues are less than 99% projected or expenditures are greater than 101% projected over the course of 4 measurement periods. Well, what does that mean? That adjustment means that our aid allocation and budget planning is at the mercy of state revenue receipts and expenses through 2020, 2021. Throughout the year, the state will evaluate how it's doing fiscally and will adjust its payments, including potentially state school aid payments, accordingly. We have no idea what that's going to look like. For good or ill, the first evaluation or measurement period is the month of April. So while this month will likely have horrible numbers for the state, it should give school districts an insight into how the state budget director will look at school aids and how school revenue shortfalls, or how state revenue shortfalls, will impact the school district. The measurement periods are the month of April, and then the next one is May and June, followed by the 6-month period, July through December, and then finally January 1 to March 31, 2021. Just a reminder, the state's fiscal year operates April 1 to March 31, whereas ours is July 1 to June 30th. So where do we turn to figure out how to calculate what these mid-year adjustments could be? How do we generate a bad, worst case scenarios to deal with this? To do that, we look back in history, back to the Great Recession that began in 2008. In 2009-10 school year, the state pulled back from its commitment to state aid allocations mid-year with a deficit reduction assessment restoration, or DRAR, cut. There were 2 rounds of DRAR that year, and between the 2 rounds, our district lost over $600,000 in state aid. Beginning in 2010-11, the state reduced school aids during the budget process with the GEA, or Gap Elimination Adjustment. In 10-11, the aid reduction was more than $725,000. It continued in 2011-12 and 12-13, and then began tapering off over the next 3 years. Over the 7 years of DRAR/GEA, the district lost more than $3.66 million of state aid. The average aid loss for those first 4 years, the highest 4 years, was 8.71%. This is the number that was incorporated into revenue scenario 4, and it represents nearly $800,000 aid reduction if that's the amount that comes to fruition this year. We then took the new state aid run and modified revenue scenario 2 to match it up to the April 1 aid run. And we're using that now as our base scenario for this round of budget building. Revenue scenarios 1, 2, and 3 can be discarded at that time. But revenue scenarios 4 and 5 need to be kept and accounted for just in case. Revenue scenario 5, a 15% reduction in general aids would be catastrophic and represents a cut of nearly $1.3 million in revenues for the district. Before we can turn to the worse and worser case scenarios, I don't even know if 15% is the worst. I want us to focus on the April aid run and what that tells us. The April aid run included a $111,000 aid reduction compared to the EBP released in January. With already having an existing budget gap, this makes the process of balancing the budget more challenging but not insurmountable. Please note that if you're looking at this table comparing the two, the EBP as drafted would have eliminated a number of expense-driven aids and rolled those amounts into foundation aid allocation. So you can't really compare apples to apples, line to line. The final state aid budget rejected that proposal, and the April 1 aid run shows each of these aids separately. We discussed at previous board workshops that there's a mechanism in the tax cap formula to increase property taxes to cover the local share of capital costs, including debt services, so that operational funds do not have to be used for these. The amount of the exclusion is reduced by transfers from the debt service fund, a separate fund from the operating fund, to help pay the costs. For Morrisville-Eaton, our local share of capital costs for 2021 is just under $305,000, of which $150,000 would be funded by the interfund transfer that we normally budget for. This gives the district $154,670 capital exclusion that can be added to the property tax levy without exceeding the tax cap itself. The impact on the tax levy is shown on this table. Without the exclusion, the district's tax levy would increase 2.21%. For a property taxpayer paying $3,000 in property taxes in 2019, that it equals an additional $66.30. With the exclusion, the tax levy increase would be 5.45%. That same property taxpayer, for that same property taxpayer, that's an increase of $163.50 over the 29 taxes, or about 26 cents a day. And this is how it impacts the revenue scenario, or total revenues in the budget picture. With the aid run allocations combined with expense reductions discussed earlier, the projected deficit would be nearly $360,000. Adding additional revenues represented by the property tax capital exclusion calculation reduces that deficit to $205,000. To get expenditures to balance to revenue amounts of either 17.3 without the additional tax levy revenue or 17.5 with will require further action. We either have to raise taxes further by exceeding or piercing the tax cap, or make further spending reductions, or do both, because there still remains a $205,000 deficit to cover. Piercing the cap creates opportunities and carries with it risks. First, it could prevent cuts of services to students, but it also leaves those cuts on the table, cuts that have been evaluated by the administrative team to be less impactful on students in case the state budget director were to cut state aids, which we fully expect. And because the budget would be voted on again, if it failed at the ballot box, the budget could then be represented not with the piercing of the tax cap, but with those budget cuts. In addition, a recent Thoughts Exchange community survey, respondents were supportive of a tax increase to prevent cuts to programs and services for students. But a decision will need to be made relatively quickly as to whether to pursue this option or not. Once the property tax report card is filed with SED, that decision has been made. And piercing the tax cap does require a supermajority of voters. Piercing the cap by $200,000 would result in a tax levy increase of $460,000 when combined with the capital exclusion. That's a 9.64% increase over last year's levy, and almost $355,000 more than the base tax cap amount. For that same taxpayer who paid $3,000 in 2019, that's an increase of about $289, or roughly 80 cents a day. But with no further cuts, piercing the cap would, for all practical purposes, eliminate the remaining budget gap in the 2020-2021 district budget. A decision on whether to pierce the cap will need to be made relatively soon, as I noted, as the property tax report card needs to be finalized and submitted to SED 24 days prior to the budget vote. The budget vote could be as soon as June 2nd, which would require final action prior to May 11. So what if we look at spending cuts instead? The budget gap could be closed by making spending reductions. To do so would require including items that scored a 2 on the administrative team's rankings, but which items? To further differentiate the items that scored a 2, the administrative team rescored these items on a scale of 2.0 to 2.9. The lower the score, the closer to 1, the stronger the team felt that the item should be maintained if possible. But the exercise was not a simple numbers game. After reviewing the team scores, the administrators discussed these items and moved some up or down on the list based on those conversations. So in the narrative report, you'll see items with a lower score included on the page above items that had a higher score. For example, eliminating the library aid scored a 2.5, and part-time reductions in various academic content areas in the middle high school scored a 2.8. But through the discussion, the aid cuts were moved up and the classroom teacher FTE reductions were moved down the list. Generally, those items that scored 2.5 or greater were included in the list of reductions being recommended to close the budget gap if spending cuts is the direction that the board wants to go. And these are the items that were selected for recommendation. These items totaled more than $230,000 and would put the district in a balanced budget position based on the April 1 aid run. This slide identifies reductions and eliminations being recommended if spending cuts are the preferred avenue to balance the budget. Also included in the far right-hand column is a timeline for action for these items. The BOCES special education slots that the district has included in the commitment form for 2021 requires guidance as soon as possible. BOCES is waiting on districts to revise their commitment forms for next year as they are working on addressing their staffing issues in the context of their collective bargaining agreements. Please note that the cost for these slots will change as as well. In other words, for those special ed positions, it's on a per pupil basis. And if you have the same fixed cost for 8 students to distribute them across, that per student cost will be lower than if you only have 7 students in that class for those same costs. So these numbers are going to be changing as well. The pros of these reductions is that it does not require asking taxpayers to support a higher tax levy. They have minimal impact in the classroom, and they balance the budget. The downside is that by going for spending cuts rather than increased revenues, this removes options available to implement if the state budget director reduces school aids. Here we can compare the 2 alternatives side by side. The first column, we see the $205,000 shortfall with revenues based on the April 1 aid run and the tax cap, including the capital exclusion amount, and expenditures with reductions in those items that scored a 3. The second column, we added the $200,000 pierce the cap option and left the expenditures alone. In the third, the revenues do not include piercing the cap, but the spending cuts that I just showed you are included and used to close the gap. Because of the short window of availability to implement piercing the tax cap and not having the opportunity to exercise the option later, it's recommended that the board approve piercing the tax cap for 2021. If the budget is voted down, as I noted, the budget resubmission without a tax cap pierce can be submitted to the voters, which would include the reductions. If the budget is approved, it does not prohibit the board from moving forward on some or all of these items to reduce costs, either in anticipation of likely mid-year aid reductions or to build fund balance for the future. The budget presented to the community should be based on the April 1 aid run revenues with or without the tax cap pierce and an appropriate corresponding expenditure level. This will represent the ceiling for district spending for 2020-2021. And I want to be careful here. I'm using the word contingency, not in the way that the state defines contingent budget planning. This is contingency planning as it's more commonly used from this point on. So what if revenues are lower than this budget? Shouldn't expenditures also be cut for that possibility? Because the budget is an up to number, it does not preclude the district from making further budget reductions in anticipation of or in response to state aid cuts. So it's important to look at other items that the administrative team reviewed and evaluated to be prepared to act if necessary to respond to such changes. One direction to turn is to look at additional revenues again. Two options possible are to increase the interfund transfer from debt service fund to the operating fund and or to pierce the tax cap by more than $200,000. After $150,000 transfer in 2021, there will be approximately $245,000 balance remaining in the debt service fund used to pay down future debt payments. Using this amount and closing out the debt service fund is an option, but increasing the interfund transfer amount is net zero for the first $154,670, as every dollar that's transferred over the $150 reduces the capital exclusion allowable under the tax cap formula. So the net impact really is about $90,000. It is worth considering, but it does impact the tax cap report card as it negates the capital exclusion. This would also result in a tax levy increase of 6.4% with a $200,000 pierce rather than the 9.6%. This equals about $192 or less than 53 cents a day for the property taxpayer who paid $3,000 this year. The actual transfer amount would not need to be finalized until next spring and could be based on need once we have more data about mid-year aid reductions. Using the transfer in 2021 would mean that a higher capital exclusion would be available for 21-22. For example, this year, the exclusion was $154 because of the $150,000 transfer. If the transfer were zero, then the exclusion could be up to $304,670. A higher tax cap Pierce could be evaluated as well. In addition to looking at other revenue sources, the board needs to consider additional spending reductions if state aids are reduced by 8.7%, even with the additional revenues just discussed. An additional $325,000 in reductions are needed to balance the budget against an 8.7% aid loss with the increased transfer and a $200,000 cap Pierce. Without the transfer, that amount jumps to $415,000. The remaining items that were scored a 2 by the administrative team total approximately $360,000. This is those items. Those items that scored a 2 begin to directly impact classroom instruction and the students we serve. They're listed here for your consideration, but these are cuts that get to the bone. They are not merely trimming the fat. Dates for implementation are also listed for these. The most urgent of these is the layoff deadline for teachers as specified in the MEFA collective bargaining agreement. The August 1 deadline for the SPO program is based on a 30-day notification in their agreement with the county sheriff's office. And again, with BOCES positions, they need to be considered as soon as possible because of their layoff timelines. In addition to these items scored a 1 on the initial round. These are items that administration feels should not be touched unless absolutely necessary. They total an additional $290,000 net of aid reductions in the following year. Included in here is a pay freeze for members of MEFA for the year. One way to address a MEFA pay freeze, however, is to make it conditional upon the state aid receipts. Since the whole idea of putting it in place is because we don't know what our revenues are going to be. If aid reductions are not as deep as what seems eminently possible, then part of the 2% or all of the 2% pay increase could be back in place on a sliding scale depending on the actual depth of the cuts in aid. The restoration could be done at the end of the 2021 school year and included in base salary considerations for pay increases moving forward, so members of that bargaining unit are held harmless. This slide shows an example of one way that could be structured if the union was willing to agree. Finally, several items were identified, but the team has not yet pinned down how much, if any, reduction is possible. Some are difficult to implement, such as cutting music FTE with the recent rapid growth in the program and the elimination of a part-time itinerant teacher that was already listed as a level 2 cut. Making changes to staffing FTE, especially challenging. There are some costs that are completely dependent on outside factors, such as staffing needs that are related to student IEPs. So how does this all mean? What does all this mean to a budget if aid is cut 8.7% and these cuts are implemented? Without upping the transfer from debt service and having a $200,000 cap Pierce and implementing the cuts identified as a 2 or 3, there would be a deficit remaining of about $105,000. With the transfer, that deficit would be reduced to $15,000. Implementing all of the budget cuts would result in a $400,000 surplus. And if aid reduction does hit 15%, all of the cuts, all of the revenue actions that have been discussed would be needed to keep the district in a relatively balanced budget position next year. The biggest challenge now is determining which actions to take when based on the deadlines imposed by the state or under our collective bargaining agreements. Have you seen we tried to minimize the impact on teaching FTE to balance the budget? These are not the first cuts, but the obligation of our contract requires the board to act on these items first. By May 15, the district is to provide notification to someone that may not be returning next year to their teaching position. But we're not looking to reduce staffing unless we experience aid reductions, which we won't know about until some unknown date in the future. The conservative thing to do in this case is to issue the layoff notices and to hope to be able to recall the impacted staff members if there are no aid cuts announced after the 2 state budget measurement periods. This will require clear and empathetic communication to the impacted teachers about what's happening and why, particularly if we do not want to lose them, a distinct possibility. Deadlines for state budget approval process are shown here. At this time, we do not yet know when the budget vote and board elections will be held. We do know that it will be after June 1. The first Tuesday in June is the 2nd, so that date is possible. There is a discussion of June 9 as well, as that would allow for a revote date of June 30th, 21 days after the initial vote, and still before the new fiscal year for the schools begin. All the information provided this evening, and with some unknowns that we hope to know before the budget is finalized, it's important that board members carefully weigh information and options laid out in this presentation. No actions required at this time, but additional budget workshop and special board meetings should occur in early to mid-May, depending on when the state sets the budget vote. At this meeting, options can be weighed and tweaked, but there are decisions that need to be made, whether to tax for the capital exclusion, whether to pierce the tax cap, and if so, by how much, whether to issue layoff notices to MEFA members, and if so, which positions. The budget can be finalized in the ensuing weeks and approved for publication in accordance with the timelines required by the states. The slide in the next lay out the timeline in a calendar format. Note that it shows deadlines for both a June 2nd budget vote and a June 9 budget vote. As of this morning, there's been no word about when that budget vote would be. The deadlines based on June 2nd are shown in bold, and those in for June 9 are shown in italics. And there's May, June. So this timeline works for a budget vote date. The budget does need to be finalized 7 days prior to the budget hearing. The May 19th regular board meeting works for either option, as a budget vote on June 2nd would have a budget hearing on May 26th, and the budget vote on June 9th would have a budget hearing on the 2nd. The big difference in the workshop dates is completely revolves around filing the tax cap report card either on or before May 11th in the case of a June 2nd budget vote, or on or before May 18th in the case of a June 9th vote. And with that, I want to thank you for your time and consideration. Any questions on the presentation?
Hey, Bob, this is Steve. I have a question for you. If we pierce the tax cap, is there a negative outcome for us?
If we pierce the tax cap and what?
Would there be a negative outcome in 2021 or 2022 because we pierced the tax cap?
That's a question I hadn't thought of. I'd have to look at that and get back to you.
Okay.
And if we pierce the tax cap, then the following year when they do the next tax cap, will it be based on the higher budget, which means that our tax cap would be higher?
I'm going to pull up give me 1 second here. I want to pull up my worksheet on tax caps. As I understand, as I'm looking at the formula right now, there's nothing, the first line is the prior year actual levy amount. And there's nothing to back out piercing the tax cap. So that would become that now becomes part of the base moving forward, if I'm reading this correctly, but I'll confirm.
On the revenue side, Bob, Do you have any indication where we're going to land at the end of this fiscal year? And would funds be available to apply to next year's budget?
This past week and a half has been more focused on this budget presentation. I'm actually starting to dive back into 1920. I can answer that next week for you.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And if you know, I'm a big proponent of trying to refund our fund balances, but if there was a fund balance, if we use it, does that preclude us from aid in other areas?
I do not believe so, but I will verify.
Okay, thank you.
I was just thinking when you were presenting too, with capital exclusion, I understand the concept of it allows us to have a budget within the tax cap at 5.8%. But if we didn't claim the capital exclusion and left it at 2.21%, and we were asking the voters to approve a 9% levy increase, for example, we're going above.
By 7%, yeah. I see where you're going.
Would there be benefit to holding on to the ability to incorporate a capital exclusion a year from now?
I don't think so, because I think we've been missing out on it. I mean, if we take the exclusion going forward next year, again, it's back to how do they calculate it? Does that become part of your base number that you're working with?
The exclusion does not become part of the base number. So the exclusion is backed out and then recalculated and added at the end.
Okay.
But if we did the 9.6% and all of it being a piercing number instead of the tax cap number, that then creates a larger base for 2021 to add the capital exclusion on top of.
Okay, I guess I follow you.
Yeah. Is that what you're asking, Greg?
Yeah, we'd be in a better position if we were able to apply the capital exclusion a year from now, because you can only do it once, right?
Well, the capital exclusion is recalculated each year. So it's added in, or when we start the tax cap calculation for this year, last year's would have been backed out, but ours was 0, so there's nothing to back out. And then you add it in. Next year, this year's exclusion amount is backed out, recalculated based on next year's debt, local share of debt, and then added back in.
All right.
I guess the only way I look at it is if you add it in this year and you publish that, the tax cap is 5%. That's what it calculates out. And then when you say, well, we are considering piercing it by going to 9%, all right, we're increasing it 4%. If you publish a 2% tax cap and say we want to pierce it, now you're telling people we're going to add 7%. And there might be some negative PR to that. I mean, I know in the thought exchange there may be supportive of it, but by the time they see it on paper, it might be a different issue or on a voting ballot.
It's true, and we also realize there's some bias in the thought exchange as well. That didn't go out to everybody. It went out to families and faculty.
Excuse me for just a minute. I'm looking at Bob's question and answer screen. Should I be looking at a full screen now? This is new. There you go. Now I can see people better. Thank you. That's fine. It's new to me too. But you see what I'm talking about, Greg?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I hear you. And the other thing, what I was saying was, there is a level of bias in the thought exchange as far as who received it.
Okay.
get to participate in it. And there's also, if for some reason the community said no on whatever level we came out at, we have a number of 5.8% that is within the levy limit, so we could back out some, as painful as it would be, but at least we're not having to go all the way down to 2.21.
Right.
The
Right.
challenge though, Greg, is that before the first budget vote, we have to file with SED the property tax report card. And I don't know if there's a mechanism to amend the property tax report card between the first budget vote, if it failed, and the second budget vote.
Yeah, so I guess my position is that we would, you're talking about restructuring our debt payments, right? I think we would have to make a decision of not restructuring our debt payments so that we know what our capital exclusion is going to be.
Yeah.
And I think your slide pretty much tells the story. The first $150,000 has a net zero impact, right?
Correct.
If you publish that we're gonna pierce the cap, or if you submit to the state that we're gonna pierce the tax cap to the full, say 9%. But before the budget vote, there's a different budget run that maybe would be positive to us. Can we go back to the 5% before the vote?
Has to do with when we have to publish it, right, Bob?
Yeah, I was going to say it. That's why.
I know it's a compressed time frame too.
Yeah, the budget approval, I think anything, once the budget's approved for publication at the May 19th board meeting, our hands are tied.
Okay.
And I don't know that the state will make any adjustments after April 30th. Well, it'll be within 2 weeks of April 30th. And then I don't think they're going to do anything with it until June 30th.
Okay.
For the next round anyway. There is some other work that I'm trying to explore too, that has more to do with working with retirement and formulas and opportunities where we could generate. There's the possibility, a potential for reduced expenses, but it's still too early to know if we're going to be able to do anything. When I first did some quick analysis of what is possible, I could see a possible reduction of $200,000 in expenses, but there's a lot of uncertainty with that as well. I'll share more if we're able to move forward with it, but I just want you to know that we're looking under every rock, every formula, every way that we can try to find creative ways to reduce expenses. Because as I was talking to Bob earlier today, I really feel like with these budget scenarios, we're starting to cut into the bone. I had a conversation with Cliff Moses today. He said, he realizes that he's not talking about big budget dollars, but his budget's tight too with Town of Eaton. And it sounded like there's not going to be a continuation of the support of the SPO program from the town of Eaton. So the bigger side of that is it's possible that Madison County is not going to continue the sponsorship of that program either. So that may not even be anything. It may be out of our hands of even considering, because it would more than double the cost of the SPOs if all those pieces were to come together. So when you factor all those pieces, there's some potential. It wasn't part of it was a deeper part of the budget process, but it may be something that rises to the top part of budget reductions that may save something else that's painful as well.
Well, that's why I would like to, I know Bob's been overworked and everything, but like if we can look forward in this budget, and if we could, I would rather use local revenues, then cuts. It's as simple as that, you know.
Yep.
If we can't fund, you know, replenish our fund balance, you know, we've been there before, but.
Well, and towards that end, the 1920 update item will help towards that, but I know that there are other places that, you know, our costs are going to be significantly lower because we're not incurring any new costs. You know, with the exception of gasoline. We're using the small buses and we're burning through gasoline like crazy, but we're not spending anything on diesel.
Right.
So I will have more update on 1920 next week, definitely.
The other question I had about ERS and TRS, they may have published a rate, but because they fund themselves with the stock market, is there a chance that that rate will increase dramatically, or do they guarantee it for the year?
I don't know. I have not seen them been through that experience to know if they would make that change mid-year. The wording I saw was that it was going to be 9.53% from TRS. So I don't know if they just take the loss for the year and then make it back up on the back end, or if they do a mid-year adjustment.
Okay.
Like I said at the beginning, I gave you a lot of meat to chew on. There's a lot of material.
That would be an understatement.
I just want to briefly, you know, the narrative report parallels the presentation I just gave. If you have any questions about that, feel free to get me a message, or, you know, ask me a question and I'll get an answer for you next week. Sometimes I know my history background comes out and my writing style is a little rambly, as opposed to necessarily being as concise as some others. But you know, most of the data that is in that report was what was in the presentation. The expenditure, as of right now, we only have 3 students that we're expecting to be there, but we wanted to budget in case we have a move-in, or in case somebody is identified during the course of next year. So we don't have a negative budget impact in the middle of the year for, you know, a service that we have to provide that we don't have planned for. And so those sub items on that report, I know it's long, it's more just to kind of glance through. The sub items appear in gray underneath what they refer to. So if we go to the very top, you'll see the first gray line is staff development, Herc BOCES SBI, that's the School Board Institute, cost of $947, and it shows up in the budget line immediately above it and to the left. So if you have questions about how to read that, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer those. The 4 different
I have on that is if people could kind of keep that confidential, it does have names and stuff in there of.
Yep. The tax cap calculation scenarios are all, the 4 different scenarios are laid out there with the whole calculation, including how we calculate out the capital exclusion process. And I worked very closely with John Bick at Fiscal Advisors to make sure we got, you know, that my understanding was on target. John reviewed this and said, yeah, that makes sense. And then those numbers are plugged into different revenue scenarios, which is the last document that you saw. So, and these numbers, these PDFs were created last week. Some of them have already been tweaked and have changed in the last 4 days. So, so if things don't match up precisely to what's in the presentation, that's why. And in the presentation, I wanted to do rounding. So most things were rounded to the $500. So it was 300, it was rounded up to 500. If it was 249, it was rounded down to the 1,000. So I hope that makes sense. Any other questions at this point?
I'm good.
I'm all right.
I think we're set, Bob.
Okay. I'm going to mute myself then unless I'm called upon.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anybody have anything for an executive session at this point?
No.
Okay. On to new business. So can I have a motion to approve the furlough shared work plan workforce reduction proposal to be between April 20th and June 1st, 2020, or until school is reopened, whichever comes first. The following groups of support staff employees will be placed on unpaid leave. At least 9 and up to 10 aides, 2 nurses, at least 5 and up to 6 night cleaners, 4 drivers, up to 2 kitchen workers. The following support staff employees will be reduced by 60 to 40% status. 11 aides, 9 drivers, 1 clerical staff. The following support staff employees will be reduced by 50 to 50% status. 2 head day cleaners, 6 kitchen workers, 1 maintenance worker, and 2 mechanics. The following support staff employees will be reduced by 20%, 80% status. 6 clerical employees, 1 computer service technician, and 1 head groundskeeper, building maintenance worker. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Discussion? This is
I
all.
know that Joe or Jackie had asked the question, but I want to make sure that this does not impact their health coverage, this action. Am I correct in that statement?
That is correct, Murray.
Okay, thank you.
This is all relative on an approval from the state or from somebody, I thought, correct?
It's left as, the wording was very specific, very chosen very particularly to, I wouldn't go forward with this if I got recommendation. It would be more of the federal government. Okay, I'm looking for confirmation that we're going to be penalized by doing this. Okay, I think we're operating under the spirit of the law, the spirit of the CARES Act. But we don't know what the spirit is.
Okay.
We're guessing.
Well, I think you might also be referencing Bob's comment that if it was submitted to the state by noon on Friday, it would have been approved and been able to be enacted by the following Monday.
Correct.
So I think that's the other, it is submitted to the state, but it sounded like it would be a pretty standard, just process it.
Okay.
And I don't think it can be submitted until we approve it.
Okay.
I think it's that type thing.
Okay.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
I
Any opposed? Okay, motion carries. And I assume we
We have the amendment on the agenda for people that want to take advantage of privilege of the floor. There's a phone number that can be called into to speak with the board or ask questions. That phone number is 315-684-5919. Again, 315-684-5919.
and wait
May I wait for the phone to ring?
for. Okay.
And I guess there's no questions.
That gives them a chance to pick up the phone.
Okay.
Or find that cordless.
Again, the phone number is 315-684-5919.
Call now and we'll double your offer with free shipping.
Your phone call is very important to us. Please stay on the line. Our phone line is still empty.
I think we're good.
Okay, and still no need for an executive session?
No.
All right, can I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great week. We'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Okay, Jody, how
Good
do I
night,
back out
everybody.
of this now? Just start.
Just dismiss.
Yeah.
So we're still speaking.
So, Murray, do you see a